Welcome to the Clarity Podcast, where we inspire you to live life by design and not by default. I'm your host, David Prosper, and today we have a fascinating guest joining us, Akash Doshi. Akash is a digital strategy leader at Delta Airlines and Delta Vacation, known for his innovative approach to mental models, leadership, and professional growth. His insights help individuals and teams gain clarity on big picture, prioritize effectively, and accelerate learning through structured framework. Akash, welcome to the show.
Hey, glad to be here, David. Thanks for having me on and excited for a great conversation today.
Awesome. Can you share some of the most impactful mental models you've used to help individuals and organizations gain clarity?
Yeah, I would love to because, like you said in your intro, it's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I've dedicated a large portion of my career to how do we create clarity in a world where everything is fighting for your attention, and it's sometimes hard to kind of keep that tunnel vision and understand, hey, what's important to me right now. And so, one of my favorite things to do is take concepts from data science and statistics and find ways to apply them to our real life, right? Our everyday life. And so one of those things is law of large numbers. The basic concept with law of large numbers is that as your sample size with data grows larger, it becomes more indicative of your population. And my kind of weird extrapolation for how I apply this to my own life is giving enough shots to understand if something fits. So I think a lot of times in life, we're like, let's try something new. Let's figure out if this is something that works for me. And so we may try it one, two, three times. And then, if it doesn't work out or the results aren't what we expected, we kind of, toss it in the bin and we move on to the next thing. And I think what we owe ourselves as humans is to take enough shots, right? And to essentially say, maybe it didn't work out the first three times, the first five times, but I'm actually going to try it 10, 20, 30, 50 times, get those reps in. And then, what you may start to learn about yourself is that your expected outcome and the outcome you start to see as you try more and more, they start to converge. They start to get closer and closer together. And so that's something I use when we're trying something new, we're figuring out if something works in our lives. Give it enough reps, try it as much as you can, and see if that sample data starts to match what you expect out of yourself.
So I'm just curious, as a former collegiate athlete, one of the things my coaches would always tell us is practice doesn't make perfect, practice make permanence. If my question is, if we're taking the shots at the wrong place, or how would we know which places to take the shots? Because we can be taking the shots at the wrong place, and then now we're creating a permanence versus like taking a shot at clarity. So how would you break that down?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it speaks to the idea of we don't know what we don't know, right? And you could be heading in the wrong direction. But a lot of times we don't know until we get that data, right? Until we figure out and then we can look at, our results and say, hey, was this the right direction or was it the wrong direction? And I think that's exactly what kind of like increasing that sample size speaks to. You may get a lot of reps in and you may have dedicated a lot of time to it, and those results still don't match up with what you maybe thought was going to happen. And, it's a good way of it's a good gut test, right? It lets you understand, hey, this wasn't the best direction for me to head in, but now I know this isn't the right path, right? Let me pivot and try something else. So I think it's kind of both sides, right? As you get more sample data, as you try something new more and more, you may figure out it's the right thing for you. You may figure out it's the wrong thing, but that data gives you an indication of, am I heading in the right direction or do I need to maybe pivot a little bit and try something else?
So like you mentioned data, and as a leader, how can leaders use data more effectively to guide, to lead, to help the people navigate when there's so many things vying for our attention?
Yeah, yeah, great question. And I think that's something all leaders struggle with is that we have these enormous data sets, right? We have information about just about everything. And it's not just in the corporate world, right? Leaders of people, leaders in their community, you get a lot of data. And the saying I always have is we don't need all the data, we need the right data. And so I think that's probably, taking a step back and saying, what are my indicators of success? What's going to tell me, what I'm looking for? And so then before you kind of start sifting through all that data, and this doesn't just have to be in a technical sense, right? Like I'm making a decision about a business. It can also be I'm making a decision about, a way in which I want to lead my community, something I want to do in my personal life. you need to first step back and understand, hey, these are like my success metrics, right? This is how I'm going to measure success. And then that allows you to kind of hone in and say, I'm going to focus on X, Y, and Z and not pay attention to anything else. And that allows you to take a very large data set and then kind of zoom in and say, hey, here are the metrics that are really going to tell me, am I heading in the right direction or not?
That's powerful. And I like the way you said it, like how leaders can use it and how they can help the people navigate. And then it's data driven, which essentially means there's facts, there's things that work, there's things that doesn't work. And it's to go like, what are you releasing and what are you keeping? So I know that you advocate for like prioritizing speed over perfection and
Yeah.
believing that faster learning cycles help us refine true like the work that we do. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I have this sort of, and it's probably not just me, but this idea of speed over quality. And when you hear it, it sounds a little contrarian, right? Because we're kind of taught to put our best foot forward, make sure we're doing things correctly, and putting the to due time and due diligence into making sure it's done right. And I'm not against that at all. But I think a lot of times we're kind of in this limbo, right? And it's something I've experienced a lot in my life as I was building out my career is and it goes back to our earlier conversation, what's the right direction to head in? And I'd kind of be in this space where I'm like, torn between 11 or 12 different things. I'd have these task lists that stretch to like hundreds of items long. And I realized I was doing a whole lot of thinking and I wasn't doing a whole lot of doing. And so that kind of gave birth to this idea of speed over quality. The idea is let's just start doing things, right? Let's start moving and, again, it doesn't just apply to business, it applies to your personal life. I think that's where I found it most effective is the faster you iterate, the faster you figure out whether it's the wrong or right thing. And I think that also speaks to what you were saying is how do we know we're taking the right shots? And when you kind of focus on speed, you're learning faster, right? Those learning cycles are happening far more quickly. And the other component is we don't always know what perfect is. Sometimes we're trying to go for perfect, but what is perfect? And when you focus on speed, like, hey, there's 5 different things I want to do. I want to start a business. Maybe I want to start a nonprofit. I want to get involved in my community by doing this. And you're like, what speaks to me the most? How do I feel like I'm going to create impact? And instead of just like spending a long time deciding, hey, what's the right direction to go in? What's right for me? Just start doing. Almost go at random, right? Start it. And then once you get that speed and you start getting those reps in, you start learning faster and you start understanding, hey, this wasn't right for me, or hey, I actually do really love this. And that gives you kind of the information you need to then understand, hey, this is perfect for me. This is what I'm striving for. But when you just kind of sit and you're torn between 12 different decisions, the honest truth is you're not going to know what perfect is until you just try one of the things.
Mm. This is interesting because I remember one of my football coaches in college would always say, uh, go fast, but don't go fast and be dumb. And it was like speaking to penalties that we would get on the field and just like how does one using speed connect with mentorship? Like, where do you see the two parallel? Because when I hear that, my knee jerk reaction is like, okay, like, yes, I understand the concept at a super high level, but if somebody is listening and just like, okay, like, so I just do it and I just do it like it and I just go crazy, that sounds a little chaotic. So how could
Yeah,
you like make that a little more practical and add some guidance to that?
that is a great point. And it really speaks to this interrelationship of mentorship and speed. And so I've spoken with a lot of leaders in my professional life and my personal life about this, right? About how do you feel about speed? And here's my take on it is that the caveat is that speed first, this framework that I've sort of built and that many others have, is that it's not true for all decisions. There's times where you have to be careful, right? There's times where you can't maybe walk back a decision. I think in most cases, like 90% of scenarios, once you open a door, it's pretty easy to walk back out that same door. So to your idea of like, hey, go fast, but don't be dumb, I totally agree with that. But I think sometimes we can actually afford to be a little dumb and say, hey, I walked through this door. It wasn't the right door. Maybe it wasn't the smartest decision, but it's not too hard for me to walk my way back. And again, the caveat is that I don't think it applies to all decisions, but I think it applies to most of them. And so then now tying in mentorship. I've spoken to a lot of my personal mentors, and one of the things I love, like that I've always found really impactful in a mentor, is someone who's willing to learn. No matter how old they are, no matter how much experience they have, they're always willing to try something new. And in my personal experience, they're pretty open to this framework, right? This idea of you have to learn something to get that data, to figure out if it's right, to figure out if it's a smart thing to do. And so that's kind of what I've heard from other folks. But I know opinions vary, and I know other folks, may see things differently and like to maybe focus on, hey, let's get things right before we maybe focus on just doing a whole lot.
I love that. And I just want to highlight, like, I love how you're so articulate in explaining it. And it seems like there's sustenance and there's depth and there's like you're learned and you're knowledgeable about these things. I'm just curious and I want to take a slight pivot. Like, what inspires Akash? Like, what drives you to learn what you learn, to contribute the way you contribute, and to give the way you give?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's impact. In one word, it's impact. I think I get a lot of personal fulfillment from knowing that the things that I do are changing someone's life. It's making a real difference in the world. And that may sound kind of cheesy or generic, but it could be something small, it could be something big, but knowing that you're improving the status quo. Things are a certain way, and then, you're doing something to improve it. It might be small, but that's kind of another saying I have for myself, which is that if it's better than the status quo, you're going in the right direction. And so, maybe there's a little bit of cost benefit analysis there, right? If it takes like very contrived example, but 20 hours to do something that maybe only results in like 1% positive change, we need to think through that. But generally, I'm of the opinion that if we're improving the status quo, if we're making things better, we're heading in the right direction. And that's kind of what I use as my North Star to say, hey, what motivates me? Am I creating an impact? And is it making things better for other humans, for the way we work? If the answer is yes, then I walk in that direction and I try my best not to look back.
That's amazing. If you're going, but if you're making this things better, you're in the right direction. And I'm paraphrasing it. I'm just curious, like, who are some leaders in your life that are both current or past that have inspired you and have invested in you? And do you currently have a mentor?
That's a great question. And so I think, throughout my career, my mentor has changed a lot of times. And I always try to stay in touch with old mentors. But, the nature, I think, of today's corporate world, professional world is that things are always changing. And so you sometimes have to find the mentor in that moment. I think a lot of my managers in the past have been great mentors. Again, speaking back to that idea of folks who are always willing to learn. They're always willing to pick up something new. They're always willing to get their feet wet, and they lead by action, not necessarily just through rhetoric or discourse, but they're willing to, kind of get their hands dirty, right? And do the things, put in the reps, and that's something I've always admired. Now, to your actual question, who is my mentor? I think the one mentor that has always stayed constant in my life is my dad, my father. So many things I can say about him, but really he's really instilled this sense of optimism. And I think, sometimes in today's world, we associate being optimistic with being a little naive, right? Because there's so many realities, or there's one reality, but there's so many things going on that, all this, there's these really tough things happening in the world, socially or just generally. And so maybe it's hard to have this sense of optimism. But something I've always learned is through my dad is that he never gave up, right? He's always willing to find something new. He never complains, which is something that I've always really admired about him, because I think in today's world, for good reason, it's easy to find reasons to complain, find reasons to be unhappy. But he's always had this sense of optimism and this idea of never giving up. And he has a saying, which is that if you work hard enough, if you really put in the time, put every fiber of your being into something, the world will bend to your will. And I think the message behind that is that, things may not work out your way. You may be putting in all the time and energy in the world, but if you keep pushing, something has to give, right? If you don't give, something else has to give. And it's this idea of never stop trying. And it's something that's really spoken to me, and it's something I try to hold with me whenever I'm going through something or trying to work through a personal or professional issue. Just this idea of don't give up.
Don't give up. I like the way your dad put it. He says, if you don't give in, the world has to bend to your will. And the illustration that I get from that is the river versus the mountain. The mountain is this tough thing that's seems immovable, but the river is constantly eroding the sharp edges and making its way through. So that's
That's a
powerful. So as a leader or someone who's aspiring to be a leader and they're trying to get clarity and they're trying to, like there's so many directions that they can take. Akash, like what would be some steps that some aspiring leaders, both professionally and personally, can start taking today to grow their capacity the way you are right now?
growing your capacity. I think the reason I think this is a great point is because you're almost reading my mind. It's something I've focused a lot on, and we're entering the new year. We're fresh into 2025. And one of my resolutions at a very high level was focus on less, not on more. Less is good. Less is better. And I think a lot of what I've dealt with in the past is trying to focus on too many things at one time. And something a really good mentor always told me is less is actually more, right? And so I think, when we think about capacity, how do you grow your capacity? It's actually, let me actually narrow down and focus on the one or two things that really truly matter. And by that, you may actually find that your capacity increases, not necessarily in like the breadth of the things you're doing, but the depth, right? You're able to go deeper. And so that's how I see it. Maybe the answer to increasing your capacity is almost like a catch 22, do less. And that's the short answer, but that's how I'm thinking about it right now.
Freaking countercultural, right? We hear about the new year, it's new year, new goals, and it's just like more and more and more. And culture tell us to consume. One of my favorite books called Subtract and talks a lot about subtracting things versus adding things to your life. And you're talking about to increase in capacity, it's more about depth than breadth. So it's more about going deeper than going wider. And we think capacity is like when I think about it, it's like growing muscles. So I want my muscles to physically expand, but you're talking about going deep and being more grounded. What grounds you? I'm just curious.
What grounds me? Yeah, that's a large question, right? Because and again, I think when me and you first introduced ourselves prior to this podcast, we were talking through this idea of so many things fighting for our attention, and I mentioned it at the beginning. So it kind of feels like you're up in the air. That's the best analogy I can give with the world we live in. This world there's so many things always fighting for your attention, and so how do you kind of like you're in the air? How do you get yourself to the ground? For me, I think it's pretty simple. I think it's my family, focusing on my family. And almost it's a piece of nostalgia, right? I always think back earlier into my life and I was like, and I think all of us feel this. Wow, things were a lot simpler when I was a kid, right? There wasn't as much going on. Life maybe didn't feel as heavy. And so I try to think back and it's hard because, those memories become more distant and distant as you grow. But I try to think like, how did I think about things when I was a kid, right? What mattered to me? How did I see the world? And when I think back to when I was a kid, the first place my mind goes is my family. And I feel like, both my parents and my dad, especially, have had a good way of keeping life simple. They never made things too complicated for themselves. And so I think it's a two-part answer. For me personally, it's my family. I think thinking about my family really keeps me grounded, allows me to think about what truly matters in my life. And then the second thing is like try to keep things simple. And trust me, I personally deal with this so much. The world is a complicated place and it's easy for things to get super, super complex. But I try to break it down into this first principles thinking. We have these complex things we're trying to tackle, we're trying to achieve in our life, problems we're trying to solve. Let's break it down into the first principles. And then when you kind of break it down further and further and further, you get to the things that really matter to you. And so, sorry, not to go off on a tangent, but one other thing that I want to mention that I just sort of thought of is the power of writing. A lot of times when things get really complicated, and it goes back to your question of what grounds us, I find that writing things out is so, so helpful. Sounds simple, but we live in a digital age. I work in digital a lot in my professional career, and so we type a lot, right? We're constantly typing. We're using voice. We're using all these different modals to input information. Getting back to pen and paper, you have something complex in your head, just start writing. Write whatever comes to your mind. Keep on writing, and at least for me, I've realized that it creates a lot of simplicity.
Thank you for saying that. It's your family grounds you, writing grounds you when we're complicated or the world is complex and we're dealing with all these conflicts and trying to navigate through that. I'm just curious. You mentioned being in the digital world. Like how does the future look like as far as for leaders, interaction, and then gaining clarity? Because there's some things like with AI and some people like when they see certain posts, it was like, is it an AI or is it real? So how do we start deciphering or discerning like what's real and what's fake, what's artificial, what's authentic? And then how do we lead in that space because you're in that world?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I've spent a lot of my personal time, a bit of my professional time thinking through artificial intelligence, right? Use cases. What does the long term look like? And I think right now there's a lot of discourse that maybe doesn't necessarily match the technology. One good thing to note is that AI has been around for a long time, right? And when we say AI, it's become a buzzword. There's dozens of different architectures that empower artificial intelligence. I think the one that's become really popular and it's made it a topic for conversation is the idea of language models. And so just a little bit of historical context. There was this research paper by the folks at, I believe, Google Brain. May have been another unit within Google, but it was essentially this paper called "Attention is All You Need," and it gave birth to the transformer architecture, and it's powering a lot of the large language models that we see today. ChatGPT, so on and so forth, other language models like Gemini, Anthropic's Cloud, so on and so forth. And so the reason I give that historical context is that language models have extraordinary potential and they're able to generate a lot of content, right? And it goes to your question of what's real, what's not. Of course, a lot of content we see these days is now being powered by AI. I think the short answer is that there's always going to be a human on the other side. And it speaks to this concept that a lot of folks who work at the intersection of artificial intelligence and ethics is that how do we make sure humans continue to play a role in artificial intelligence? A human in the loop is essentially this idea that artificial intelligence is going to increasingly, as it moves to AGI, which is known as artificial general intelligence, which has really advanced reasoning capabilities. It's able to think, automate, speaks to agentic AI. So ChatGPT recently released a new architecture or a new model rather called ChatGPT Operator. It's different from the normal sort of ChatGPT 4.0 and 1.0 in the space that it can make decisions on its own. But at some point, a human always needs to be there. And I think us as humans, the role we're really going to play in this future in which artificial intelligence is starting to make a lot of decisions on our behalf, it's starting to reason on our behalf, is the idea of authenticity, right? We need to continue to be authentic. And I think there is going to be a space where artificial intelligence isn't going to be able to make all the decisions, right? I think there's a space where humans need to retain that authenticity. We need to be able to make really human decisions, right? Kind of a bleak example, but I was watching this movie the other day and a child is asking their other parent is in the hospital facing a terminal illness. And the child's asking the parent, you know, is my other parent, is my mom going to survive? And I kind of thought through, hey, how would an artificial intelligence be able to toe that fine line, right? Between telling your child the truth, which is, kind of ethically what's correct, and also understanding they're a child, right? They may not be able to kind of ingest that information. You have to approach it with a little bit of tact. And so I think that's maybe a good example, a random example of when humans need to continue to be there to provide that authenticity, to be able to toe the line of what's human and understand, hey, what's needed in that moment. And that's the role I see humans playing in the future, in which a lot of decisions, a lot of content are generated by artificial intelligence. I know that was a very broad answer, but that question speaks to a lot of different things. And I think humans retaining their authenticity is going to be a big part of that.
That's a very optimistic perspective that you share because there's two sides of the aisle and there's the middle. One side of the aisle is just like, oh my goodness, AI is taking over. Like you said, it's been around for a very long time. And they're like, what's going to happen to our world? And there's other people like, yes, AI. And then there's the people in the middle is like, what's happening? So the fact that you're mentioning like the authenticity and the humanity on the other side of technology and being able to connect with empathy. Granted, the technology is going to continue to advance, but we'll still never lose that part of humanity as we continue to lead and navigate. Now, if our listeners just like, okay, I resonate with this guy and I love the way he thinks, how would our listeners get in contact with you and where would they find you?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn is the best place to find me. Again, I think as we get further into this conversation, we're constantly tying it back to earlier points because this really is a broader discussion. But to answer your question shortly, LinkedIn is the best way to get in contact with me. Try to check it as frequently as possible. But if you want to connect, learn more, just chat, get to know each other, that's the best place to get in contact with me.
S- Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Akash, your insights on mental models, leadership, structured decision making are truly eye opening. And the frameworks you've shared today about being resilient, creating a clear roadmap, speed, optimizing mindset is truly beneficial. So thank you for joining us on the Clarity Podcast.
Hey, I appreciate your time, David. It's been great connecting with you and hope to stay in contact and continue to chat about. I think, you and I have this great intersection about finding clarity as your podcast name implies. And so I want to keep the conversation going and thanks again for your time.
To our listeners, if you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. You can connect with Akash on LinkedIn. Until next time, stay clear, stay inspired, and keep on designing your life with intention.